Hi, my name is Carrie Cranston. I am the president of the American Writers Museum, and I'm here to welcome you all. So thank you for coming out. I'm going to ask the question I always ask. For how many of you is this the first time you have been here? Shame on you. Come back again. We're glad you're here tonight. We hope you get a chance to look around a little bit. If for any reason you have not been inside the Frederick Douglass exhibit, it's right here behind me. So after our talk tonight, you won't all fit at the same time, but take a few minutes to walk through it. If you bought a ticket for tonight, that is good for a return visit, so make sure you keep that receipt with you and come back again if you need more time. I'm sure if you look around, you'll realize it takes a lot of time to read all of the content of our museum. So again, thanks for coming out. We have a lot of programs. There are program brochures up at the front if you want to pick them up. Our programs are listed on our website. We have authors all the time. With our Frederick Douglass exhibit, we have had a couple of different programs. Last week we had Manisha Sinha from the University of Connecticut talking about the abolitionist cause, her book that won the Frederick Douglass Literary Prize last year. So, but tonight we have a very special program, and that's what I'm here to introduce for you because you're not here to see me. So, I'm gonna read my introduction. I'm gonna put my glasses on because every time I do this without my glasses, it does not go well. So thank you all for coming out tonight. Our very special guest, Kenneth Morris, descends from two of the most influential names in American history. He is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, and he is also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Kenneth continues his family's legacy of anti-slavery and educational work as co-founder and president of the Atlanta-based nonprofit Frederick Douglass Family Initiative. His career and life path are driven by a clear focus on FDFI's mission to advance freedom through knowledge and strategic action. The FDFI works on numerous projects to educate young people around the nation and the world about the legacy of Frederick Douglass and the realities of slavery and human trafficking that still exist in this modern world. One project that FDFI has this year is the 1 Million Abolitionist Project, which seeks to get a copy of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass into the hands of as many young adults as possible in this bicentennial year of Frederick Douglass's birth. We are excited that this fall, with our write-in field trip programs, that we will be participating in this program with generous sponsorship from Allstate. We will be handing out 1,200 copies of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass to school groups that will be coming in this fall. So we're excited about that. Kenneth speaks around the country and is often on television and featured in documentaries because of his work and his legacy. He has won many awards, including the Frederick Douglass Underground Railroad Legacy Award, the Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism, and most recently the Frederick Douglass Medal from the Douglass Institute for African and African American Studies at the University of Rochester. Kenneth, like his predecessors, believes education is the pathway to freedom, and so please welcome here tonight Kenneth Morris in what I expect will be an educational evening for us all. Did I put up the right one?
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Carrie, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank the American Writers Museum for inviting me to be here this evening. It's my honor and privilege to be here with all of you, and thank all of you for coming. I'm looking forward to having an opportunity to talk to you tonight about this blood that flows through my veins of two of this country's greatest and influential heroes. And as I was introduced, I think I heard Carrie say, did he say I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass? That's three greats. And also, I thought I heard him say the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. That's a whole lot of greats. It's 5, right? Good counting. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you may be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know or knew a grandparent, and some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors. Because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl, about 8 years old. Now, she didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 95, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father. And several years ago, I was with a group of students, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and they were looking at me cross-eyed like, man, you are so far removed. And what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And so I was trying to put some context around the distance between the generations, and I had this thought that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand just one person away from history. I stand one person away from each man, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country. And I've had the honor and privilege since we started our organization, the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in 2007, to travel around the country and other parts of the world in dialogue with tens of thousands of young people. And I think a lot of times when they look at the great heroes and heroines in the history books, it's hard for them to imagine that they were real-life people that overcame obstacles and challenges and rose up to really affect change in the world around them, and in doing so, affecting change for millions of people around the world. And so what I hope to do tonight is to make this history come alive for you. I'm going to talk to you about 2 men that were born into slavery. They were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to. But yet, through the power of education, now we know that it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write, so both of my ancestors would have to steal their education. And in fact, later in life, when people would see Frederick Douglass as this white-haired statesman who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, and the list goes on and on and on. And they would say, Frederick, I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And he would respond on occasion by saying, my degree is written on my back. And yes, my ancestor would have to steal his education. And so what I thought I would do tonight is bring some family photographs, because I get a couple of questions when I meet people for the first time, and it's already happened this evening. And the first question is, so you're related to Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. So there's been a little bit of pressure there over the years to try and carry this weight of expectation and really living my life in the vast shadow of 2 of this country's great heroes. And then the other question that I get is, so Douglass and Washington were not related to each other. So how is it you're related to both of them? Anybody wondering that? Okay, well, let's start with the photographs. It happened on my mother's side of the family. And in this image, you see my grandmother looking like a movie star in the middle. And on the left of the screen is my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, and my grandmother, Nettie Hancock Washington. They met in 1941 at the school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881, Tuskegee Normal School and Institute. Now, they happened to be on campus the same day. My grandfather was a surgeon, and he'd been commissioned down there by the Veterans Administration during World War II. My grandmother, who had been born at Tuskegee, was living in California at the time, but she was just back home for the summer, and they happened to be on campus the same day. They were rushing across to get to the other side, and literally bumped into each other. Didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. They fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married 3 months later. Yeah, wow. Now, as the father of 2 daughters, I don't recommend, and I don't know, I don't see any young people out here tonight, but I don't recommend getting married after just 3 months. But there was truly a plan there, I think, to bring the families together. Also in the photograph is my grandmother's brother, Booker T. Washington III. So the significance of this image is you have Booker T. Washington III shaking hands with Frederick Douglass III, and the families are officially united. Now, here is a photograph of Frederick Douglass and also my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. Now, I like to talk about Anna because she has not always been treated well in history by historians. She was the first person in her family to be born free in Baltimore, and she never learned to read and write. Now, she and Frederick met when he was enslaved in Baltimore as a young man. And as they were starting to fall in love, she really was the first person to plant the seed of thought in his mind that, Frederick, you're not meant to be a slave. And as they're starting to fall in love, she said, I don't want our children's father, to be a slave. They were married for 44 years. When he would eventually escape from slavery at the age of 20, he would travel to New York City, write back for Anna. Anna would come immediately. They would get married, and then they would travel along the Underground Railroad up to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they would begin their family. She was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad when they lived in Rochester, New York. He was on the road all the time, so she's raising their 5 children. She's helping to ferry freedom seekers through the house that were trying to make it to freedom in Canada. And I truly believe that there would not have been a Frederick Douglass without Anna Murray Douglass. And we're in the process right now of producing a feature film on the life of Frederick Douglass, and Anna is going to have a very big role in this film. And then we just got word a couple of months ago that there's the school that's located on the site where the Douglass home once stood before it burned down is going to be renamed for Anna Murray Douglass. So we're very, very proud of her. We're just as proud of her as we are of him. In this photograph is my great-great-grandmother, Olivia Davidson Washington. Now, she was Booker T. Washington's second wife after his first wife passed away. She's the one that I descend through. She was also a very important person in the life of Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee. She was an outspoken suffragette and feminist. She was also a philanthropist and helped raise money for Tuskegee. And so there would be no Tuskegee without Olivia Davidson supporting Booker T. Washington. And I'll talk a little bit more about Tuskegee and Booker T. Washington in a second. Now, this is, I think, the photograph that I love the most. Now, in it, you see Frederick as a young man, as an older man, and sitting next to him is my great-grandfather, Joseph, Frederick Douglass's grandson. Now, Anna and Frederick had 21 grandchildren. This was the only grandchild that he was ever photographed with. So we like to say in my family that my great-grandfather was the favorite grandchild. But they had a common bond. Now, we know that Frederick Douglass taught himself to read and to write, but he also taught himself to play the violin. He taught himself to play the violin in 3 days. And he was such a great teacher, he taught Joseph how to play. Joseph continued his music education at the Boston Conservatory, and then he would go on to be a concert violinist, playing in the White House 3 times. He was the first African-American classical recording artist to record for the Victor Talking Machine Company, and then he would travel the world as a classical violinist. And so this is a photograph that we really cherish. Joseph is the only family member that Frederick was ever photographed with. Now, what I'm doing through this series of images is I want to show you just how close I am. And so you see Joseph now as an older man. Sitting down is my great-grandmother, Fanny. On her lap is my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, and his sister, Blanche. Now, do you recognize anybody in this photo? Me? Which one am I? The little guy? The tall, show of hands, how many think I'm the tall one? How many think I'm the smaller one? Well, I was with a group of students a few weeks ago, and I said, "Do you recognize anybody in this photograph?" And they said, "Yeah, that's Michael Jackson." And you know what? I thought I was Michael Jackson. I wanted to be one of the Jacksons so bad, I would have been Tito. I would dance and sing and Yes, I am the tall one there. And sitting there is my great-grandmother, Fanny, who lived to be 103, as I mentioned. And so through those 3 photographs, you saw Frederick and Joseph and Fanny, my grandfather, and then Fanny, and my brother, Douglas Washington Morris, who, by the way, got a great name. He got both of the family names. I, of course, was the firstborn and had the pleasure and the honor of being named after my father, Kenneth Morris Sr., which is a great name, in case you're watching, Dad. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He would change his name to Douglass after he escaped from slavery to make it harder for his master to be able to track him down. But he was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was born to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his father was his master. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. He used to sleep head first in an old corn sack on cold winter nights with his feet hanging out because it was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. He only saw his mother a handful of times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, and then she would walk 12 miles in the middle of the night to spend just a few precious moments with him, and he was about a year old at the time, and she would stay with him until he would fall asleep, and then she would walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to have to face a brutal beating. But he was raised by somebody early on in his life that showed him some love and nurturing, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. And her job on the plantation was to raise the master's children and grandchildren and the slave children until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor. Frederick wrote later in life, he said, "I didn't know I was a slave until I found out I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do." And when he was around 5 or 6, and the reason that I say 6 or 7, 5 or 6, that's because he was not sure what his birth date was. He didn't know how old he was. It wasn't uncommon for children to be torn away from their mother's arms, for grandchildren to be separated from grandparents, from brothers and sisters to be separated. And so when he was about 5 or 6, the only person that he knew in his life that showed him some love and care said, "Frederick, we're going to go on a long journey." And that journey was a 12-mile walk to the main plantation where, if you can imagine this little boy who only saw his mother a few times, he said his 7 siblings were like strangers to him. And so I imagine that he's nervous, and he's clinging to his grandmother's skirt, and she's carrying him much of the way when his legs couldn't carry himself. And then when they would finally make that last mile walk up the road, Frederick would run off to grab something to eat and to kind of check his surroundings. And when he looked around and he looked back for his grandmother, she was gone. And so now he truly was an orphan. And so you had this little boy that had no family, he had no home, and he had no country because he was not considered a human being. But yet, in spite of all of that, he was able to rise up through education to go on to really change the course of history. And now when I talk about his beginnings, I don't talk about it because I want us to look at it and to feel down, but to think about this idea that in spite of the inhumanity and the brutality of slavery, that education was his pathway to freedom. And so when he was around 8 or 9 years old, he had something happen in his life that changed the course of history. And I hope you listen closely to this story because it's really at the foundation of the work that we do at our organization, and it's at the foundation of who Frederick would become and what our country would become. And that was, he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland, and it was a big plantation. His slave owner, his master, was the biggest slave owner in the state of Maryland. And so there were hundreds of children, and he was the only person chosen. He said, I was the first, last, and only choice. And that was, he was sent to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's brother-in-law, Hugh Auld. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving an environment where he wasn't around people that he could learn to read and write from, and now he was going to go to Baltimore, and he was going to be in the big city. He was going to be around free black children that knew how to read and write, and he would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly when he got to Baltimore was his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had an enslaved person before. And she was just a kind Christian lady that saw this bright boy that was willing to learn, and she had a younger son that she was teaching. And so she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs. And that little spark of light into his mental darkness is what changed everything in his life. And so the lessons continued, but when his master found out about it, he got angry. And he forbade the teachings and the lessons. And he looked at young Frederick, and he looked at his wife, and he said, you cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. Did you all hear that message? You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. He'll be running away with himself. And Frederick looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power. When I talk to young people, that, of course, is a message that is as relevant today. Knowledge is power, and education would be his pathway to freedom. And so he begins to teach himself to read and write, and he was very clever. Now remember, he was moving around the city, and so he would pick up a stick off the ground, and he would go up to one of the children in the city, and he would say, Susie, is this how you write an S? And she took the stick away from him and said, no, Freddie, this is how you write an S. And he would file it away. He also carried in his pocket bread, and he traded the bread for reading lessons. And so on the screen, you see pigs eating out of a pig's trough. In his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was published in 1845, he talked about how hungry he always was as a child, how he always had this pit of hunger in his stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when he would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a trough similar to what pigs would eat out of. And Frederick, along with the other children, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, and to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He was no better than the sheep and the cattle and the horses. And so now if you think about this idea of this little boy that was always so hungry, but yet he would trade bread, he would trade food, he would trade something of such great importance, which meant he would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty. And so as he starts to move around, he's starting to think critically about his condition of enslavement and oppression as he's self-teaching himself. And then he would start to ask questions like, why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know mine? And then he would turn to God and he would pray to God for deliverance from his chains and his bondage. And he would say, God, do you mean for me to be a slave for life? Because my master puts on a suit every Sunday, goes to church, and in the Word and the Bible finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, plunder, and exploit his property. I can't wrap my mind around what I now know because I read the Bible, that God does in fact love me, and God does not mean for me to be a slave for life. So he started to differentiate from what he would later call the slave-holding power or religion of the land in Christianity versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. And so when we do our work today and we interact with young people who many are living in mental bondage, and when they hear the story about Frederick Douglass eating out of a pig's trough and trading bread for reading lessons, it connects with them. And they start to see that there's this idea that if I can just have a little bit of education, of light that sparks my mental darkness. I remember I was in Albany when we first started our work, and I was in a barber shop. and I was talking to a 16-year-old African-American boy, and he was trying to describe for me, articulate how he was feeling in his mind. And he said, "Mr. Morris, my mind is so dark. It's like a pitch-black hallway with no windows and no doors. But what you just described to me, you've just shined some light into that darkness, and now I can see that there's a way out. Now I have some hope that there's a way out." And so Frederick would try to make his first escape from slavery at the age of 18. He was given up, his plan was uncovered, he was thrown into jail for a couple of weeks, and then in 1838, September 3rd, with the help of Anna Murray Douglass selling her feather bed, helping to sew his disguise, which was a sailor's outfit, he would escape slavery, first by train and then by boat. As I mentioned, he would go to New York City, call for Anna. She would come, they would get married. They would go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and settle down. Now, when he was working in Baltimore, he had a skill as a ship caulker. And so when he got to New Bedford, he was able to get a job on the ship docks. And so now they're starting to think about a family and being together. And while he was a fugitive slave, they were still thinking about this new thing called freedom for him. But he could have just said, "You know what, let's just start a family. I'm good, I can make money doing this work." But he didn't. He and the other abolitionists started to look at this institution of slavery, this legal institution of slavery. Now, we've got a lot of problems in our country today, but imagine what that must have looked like, how daunting that must have been to have your federal government say it's legal to own you, illegal to teach you. And I think many people would run away from that challenge, and thank goodness he didn't. And so he would eventually go to Nantucket and attend an anti-slavery meeting that was being put on by William Lloyd Garrison and the Garrisonians. And Garrison heard that he had this fugitive in the audience, and he asked Frederick, he said, will you just stand up and just tell the audience your story? And again, he writes later, he said, "I was so nervous that first time speaking in front of a white audience that my knees were knocking together, I was shaking from every limb." But what he was able to do was he could stand up, and he had a gift of communication. He was eloquent, he was charismatic, he was theatrical, he was funny. But what he was doing most importantly was he was sharing with the American public firsthand experience about slavery. Prior to that, the Garrisonians were talking about moral suasion and just talking about how horrific slavery was. But now you had this person stand up and tell the world about this evil institution. Well, Garrison understood that he had a jewel in the making there, so he invited Frederick to go out on the lecture circuit with them. And so he just went from town to town, just telling a story, just telling a story. And then he started to have a problem. And that problem was people started to doubt that he had ever been enslaved. They said, "Look at the way he speaks. Look at the way he dresses. There's no way," because remember, those that were pro-slavery and the federal government were trying to dehumanize people of African descent so that they could justify enslaving them. And so they would say they're Africans, they're not worthy of freedom, they're not worthy of citizenship, they can't take care of themselves, they're better off in slavery. Listen to those happy songs that they sing. And so Frederick now is standing up and shattering that notion. So in order to prove that he had been enslaved, he wrote that autobiography, the narrative. And in it, he named names and he named places. Well, now he had another problem. What? It became a bestseller. And that's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book when you're trying to run from your master, because it made him an instant celebrity and household name. So he would have to go to Europe for a couple of years as a cooling off period. And while he was in Europe speaking out against slavery, his abolitionist friends pooled their money together and then contacted his master in the States and negotiated a lower price for his freedom, and they paid $711. And he was able to come back to the United States and really begin his life as an abolitionist. He would settle in Rochester, New York, and start the North Star newspaper, which was a leading abolitionist voice of the time. and he would spend 25 years in Rochester and really do his important work. He would become an advisor to presidents, particularly Abraham Lincoln, and he, along with the other abolitionists, were responsible for agitating, and getting Lincoln to finally make the right decision to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which only freed those that were enslaved in the states in rebellion. It would eventually take the ratification of the 13th Amendment to outlaw slavery in the land. And so that is Frederick Douglass's story in a nutshell, and because I don't have all night to give you everything, we'll jump to Booker T. Washington, and I'll tell you a little bit about my great-great-grandfather, because I can't go one place and only talk about one and not talk about the other. So Booker T. Washington benefited from the work of Douglass and the abolitionists, and he and his family were freed when that Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and he was 9 years old. He wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so he could begin his lessons during the day. And so he worked hard and he continued his lessons. And then finally one night when he was in the mines, he heard these two older gentlemen talking about this place called Hampton Institute in Virginia. Are you a graduate? I thought so. Hampton Institute in Virginia. And these gentlemen were talking about it as a place where formerly enslaved people could go and get an education. Now, Booker had no concept of what a higher education was at that time, but what he was hearing from these men sounded so good that he thought, Hampton must be heaven. And so after he had enough money and with the help of his community putting their money together, Booker would make a 500-mile walk at the age of 16 years old to go to school at Hampton. Now, that walk took a long time, as you can imagine. He ran out of money several times. He had to take odd jobs along the way. He slept outside. He slept under bridges. He was going to do whatever it took to be able to get an education, and there was no challenge too great, no obstacle too great to overcome for him to get that education, to get that prize. And so when he would finally get to Hampton, and he would go straight to the headmistress of the school, and his clothes are dirty and torn. He's disheveled. He probably didn't smell that great. But he said, I want to go to school here. And she looked at him and she said, young man, you're not worthy for admittance into this institution. Go on about your business. Well, he wouldn't take no for an answer. And he came back the next day and asked. She kept shooing him away. He kept coming back and he kept coming back. And then finally, she'd had enough and she said, okay, Booker, you're driving me crazy here. I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove yourself. There's a classroom down the hallway. Go clean that and let's see what you can do. Well, he had learned the value of hard work, working in those mines. And so now he was able to put those skills to the test. And so he went in there and he cleaned and he cleaned. And when she came in to do that white glove test, and she's looking for dirt on the windowsills, the tables, the chairs, not only couldn't she find dirt, she couldn't find one speck of dust. And so she looked at him and she said, okay, Booker, you will do for admittance into this institution. And not only that, we're going to give you the job of janitor so you could work your way through college. And so he would start at 16 years old. He would go on to graduate and then come back to Hampton to teach. And while he was there as a teacher, he heard about this place called Tuskegee, Alabama, where people had put some money together and they were looking for a founder, a principal of a new school that they wanted to start for formerly enslaved people. And so Booker was tapped to go down to Tuskegee, and he accepted that challenge. And he rushed down there, and when he got there, he was looking for an old schoolhouse or a church, somewhere where he could have a classroom really to begin his lessons. But there was nothing there except farmland, as far as the eye could see. But he didn't get discouraged. He started recruiting students, and he started getting them excited about getting an education. And then one of the first things that he taught them to do was to make bricks. Taught them to make bricks, right, so that they could build their own school. And so you see students in Tuskegee building what is now Tuskegee University, which has educated millions of people and their families. And so Booker's philosophy for education was he really understood that you couldn't start reaching for the higher aims in life until you could meet your basic needs in life. And so the education at Tuskegee sometimes started with hygiene, teaching them how to tie their shoes, how to brush their teeth. But what he taught them most importantly was he taught them a trade, a tool like dressmaking, how to farm the land, how to become an entrepreneur, how to make bricks, because he understood that coming out of hundreds of years of oppression and slavery and race-based slavery, you weren't going to get people just to change their minds about racism and their ideology. He understood that, so what he did was he showed freed African Americans how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. So Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom, and it may be said that he is the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. And so I've always known that I descended from these great men. There wasn't really a time, people ask me, well, when did you find out? You know, there wasn't a time when my grandparents or my parents sat me down and said, okay, Kenny, you better sit down. We've got something really important to tell you. I've just always known. But I was around 5 when I started to look around and I started to see my ancestors are on statues. They were on money, stamps. Schools were named for them, bridges were named for them, libraries were named for them. And everywhere I turned, I really was in this long shadow of my ancestors. And I would ask my classmates, are your grandparents on statues? They would say, no. Well, what about money? No. I spent all of my summers at Frederick Douglass's summer beach house, which was built on the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. It was built by my great-great-grandfather, Charles, who was Frederick and Anna's youngest son. And Charles, when he purchased 42 acres of land on the shores of the Chesapeake, and he kept one parcel for his dad to build a retirement home. So he asked his dad, he said, are there any special features that you want in this house? And he said, well, Frederick said, I want it to point in a certain direction, and at the top, I want you to build a tower. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life was he wanted to sit in that tower, and the house pointed toward the other side, and across the water, you could see land. And that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, where Frederick was born into slavery and where he toiled away in chains. History is important for a lot of reasons. I like to think that history is most important because we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed. And here was a man that, even though he had been born into slavery and accomplished so much in his life, he never wanted to forget where he had come from and how far he had come. And so, as I said, I spent my summers in that house, and there were Douglass and Washington photos everywhere in every room. But I remember there was this larger-than-life portrait of the man with the great big white hair. And we've seen the photographs, and if you had a chance to go into this exhibit, you've seen some of the photographs. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century because he understood at the age of 22 years old, never having spent one day of his life in a classroom, only 2 years removed from slavery, that this new technology that he was coming of age with, photography, he could use strategically to help make his arguments for liberation and equality. And he said, when you look at me, when you look at an image of me, you're never going to deny that I'm a man worthy of freedom and citizenship. And he said, I never want to look like a happy, amiable fugitive. So he was strategic in the way that he went about this. But for a young boy, seeing those photographs, and we know those earlier pictures, I'm not talking about the later pictures where he's a prophet and he's looking with a grandfatherly gaze, just so nice away this way. But no, my parents hung up the abolitionist photographs where he's looking right at me. And so there was this larger-than-life portrait at the top of the stairs in that beach house. And I remember one night walking up those stairs, and I would have to go by it to get to my room. And I stopped and I looked at him and I thought, man, you look mean. And I'm glad I didn't know you. And as I would try and sneak past or tiptoe past that portrait, you know what would happen? His eyes would follow me. And by the time I would get down to the end of the hallway, I could feel his steely glare burning like fire on the back of my neck. And I always imagined in this booming baritone voice bellowing down upon my tiny person, and he would say, "You will do great things, young man." It like reverberated like it was a 19th century abolitionist meeting hall. And I looked, I said, what? That was a lot of pressure. And to be honest with you, I didn't want anything to do with it. I spent my whole life running away from these legacies that were chasing me. I was happy to be a father and a husband. I just celebrated 34 years of marriage, and a business owner, go to church on Sunday, and I was good. I had people that I went to school with that never even knew of my relationship. Besides, when I was younger, the few times I told people who I was related to, nobody ever believed me. and I never thought it was a point worth arguing. So imagine sometimes your teachers don't believe you. Your classmates don't believe you. So I spent my whole time not even talking about it. Well, that was until everything changed in my life, and that was in 2005. I read this National Geographic magazine cover story, and the headline was 21st Century Slaves. And I looked at that headline, and I reacted the way I think most people do the first time they hear about the existence of human trafficking in modern-day slavery. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I know in my mind slavery ended with the work of Douglass and the abolitionists. But as I started to read the article, I found that slavery still existed in every country around the world, including right here in the United States. And as I started to do more research, read some other articles, I remember one night I was in my family room, and down the hallway, I could hear my girls getting ready for bed, and they were 12 and 9 at the time. And I was reading this story about this 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia. And she was forced to service countless men every single day. And I'm hearing my girls down the hallway, and they're laughing. They're reading bedtime stories. They're about to get down on their knees to say their prayers. And I'm thinking to myself, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into their beds, not being forced into bed to service some sick individual. And I started to think, like everything started to well up in me. And I had this flashback to being a boy and watching Roots. Did you guys remember watching Roots in the 70s, the ABC miniseries? It was the first time, really, I think the country was seeing what slavery really looked like in this country. And so millions of Americans were glued to their screens every night watching the story unfold. And I remember watching that and thinking, if I lived during that time, I'd be an abolitionist. I think we all think that, right? That we would fight for those that can't fight for themselves. We would speak for those that can't speak for themselves. But the problem with that thinking was that I was talking about crimes of the past. Now, all of a sudden, here I am faced with this present-day crime. And when I walked in to say goodnight to my girls, I couldn't look them in the eyes and just walk away and not do something about this. And it was really at that moment where I started to understand that I had this platform that my ancestors had built through struggle and through sacrifice. And I really felt like we could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to stand up on that platform and do something about this issue. So we started thinking, okay, let's look at the anti-trafficking landscape, which was 99.99% reactionary, a victim-centered approach, reacting after the crime has been committed, law enforcement coming in after the crime has been committed, rescuing, restoring, rehabilitating victims. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't continue to do that, but there was no effort put toward stopping new victims from being spewed into this cycle of exploitation. And as well-meaning as we are as abolitionists, as modern-day abolitionists, if we're just rescuing, restoring, rehabilitating, and we're not stopping the flow of new victims in, then I ask, are we complicit in allowing slavery to thrive and exist? And so we started thinking about the legacies of my ancestors. It was almost like, aha! So we have the great abolitionists on one side and the great educator on the other side. Abolition through education. In the same way that both of my ancestors understood that education would unfit them to be enslaved, we could institutionalize education and knowledge in the classroom, and then having young people be the agents of change, the modern abolitionists in the communities, so they're working to unfit communities to allow slavery to thrive and to exist. And so we immediately turned to schools. We didn't know what we were doing, but we turned to schools because it seemed like the right place to be. And we started talking about historic slavery, the slavery that we're most familiar with. And then we would talk about great heroes and heroines like my ancestors. And then we would ask the students to look through the prism of history and that slavery still exists in the form of labor trafficking. And that slavery is in the supply chain of almost every product that we use and consume today. And because of globalization and taking jobs to other parts of the world, and as American consumers demanding products cheaply, we want to go into the mega stores and we want to get bigger TVs, 100-inch TVs, but we want to pay less money. And so slavery is in chocolate. It's in the rugs that we stand on. It's in the clothes that we wear. It's in seafood. Everywhere we turn, really, we as American consumers have a slavery footprint. So I would ask all of you, including myself, because I have to think about this every day, because we demand these products so cheaply, in order to produce them way down the supply chain, there are men, women, and children, mostly children, because out of the 42 million people that it's estimated that are enslaved around the world, 50% of those are kids. And many are living in conditions as horrific as the slavery that I've been talking about with my ancestor this evening, and we all play a part in this. And so just, if it's not something that you've thought about before, I hope as a takeaway tonight to just think about, there's a great website called slaveryfootprint.org, where you can actually answer some questions and see how, as consumers, you are contributing to slavery in the supply chain. And so then we started talking about sex trafficking, and we were in communities that were underserved. And I remember going into the first school, it was a middle school, and I thought, okay, my kids are 12 and 9 years old, and I was thinking about how I talked to my daughters and how would I talk to the students that were the same age. And when I got into the school, I quickly learned that they knew more about this than I did because they were seeing it every day. They were seeing it in the form of forced prostitution in communities. And some of them had experienced it in their own families. And so as we started to talk about all of this, the natural question was, okay, now we're looking through the prism of history. We've talked about historic slavery. We're talking about contemporary forms of slavery. What can we do about it? And so we started to develop programs where we would train educators and other school personnel on how to recognize signs of human trafficking, labor, and sex trafficking in the classroom. When I started, the average age the young girl was forced into prostitution was 13 years old. Well, that's getting younger and younger, and it's 10 to 11 years old now. Here we are 11 years later. So there's a need to get this education, and in California, we do a program called Protect with two other nonprofit organizations based in California, where we start this education and training in the 5th grade. And in the 5th grade, it's a conversation about what is a human life worth, listening to your inner voice. Who do you let into your circle of friends, your circle of family? And then as we get into the 7th grade, it continues, and there's more of a conversation where sex trafficking is introduced. Then it goes into the 9th grade, where the bulk of the information is delivered. And then the 11th grade, it's in a U.S. history class, where now, after the 3 previous years of education, again, the students are asking, okay, how can we become modern-day abolitionists? And they look at abolitionists from the 19th century and how they went about communicating the inhumanity of slavery, and then they do service projects in their community. And we're really starting to see that young people are starting to think critically in the same way that Frederick Douglass started to think critically about his condition of oppression and enslavement. Our young people are working together, and they're starting to look at these institutions in communities of color and poor communities that conspire to keep those communities down, and to start to look at how does systemic racism, which runs throughout American institutional life, affect how they live their lives, and why there are disparities in education and economical opportunity and health care and all of the things that we know and exist in these communities. And they're starting to get to work by using their passion, their talent, their creativity, their intellect. We've had students that have presented at the UN on several occasions. They've written op-eds for their local papers. They've started websites. They've done art exhibits. They've created documentaries and upload to YouTube. When Frederick Douglass published his first book, I mentioned it was a bestseller, it sold 5,000 copies. I've met students that have 5,000 Instagram followers. And through the stroke of a key, they can reach more people with a message than Frederick Douglass could have reached his whole publishing career of the North Star newspaper. So we're asking young people to use the tools that they have at their disposal to be able to communicate the inhumanity of slavery and be the agitators in their community, be the abolitionists in their community. And so now I want to talk to you about what we're doing for Frederick Douglass's bicentennial this year. We have, as you heard Carrie say in the introduction, we have republished a special bicentennial edition of his first autobiography. And we wanted to make this accessible to young people. We wanted to inspire the next generation of leaders with the words of Frederick Douglass. My whole life being his descendant, I've had people of all ages and all races come up to me, many times with tears in their eyes. And what the common theme is that they want to say thank you. They always remember how old they were, what grade they were in when they were introduced to Frederick Douglass's autobiography. And when I was younger, I couldn't really understand the emotional connection that so many had to my ancestors. But it was a lady several years later that said, I read this book, and I am the leader I am today because of Frederick Douglass's words. And if I could say thank you to him, which I can't do, you become the conduit to saying thank you. So now I understand why they wanted to pinch my cheeks and kiss me on the cheeks and pat me on the head. And so I know firsthand how his words can inspire a young person. And so we're working to give away 1 million copies of this book by the end of 2019. And we're so proud to have partnered with this museum, as you heard, to give away 1,200 books, which we'll be doing in the very near future. There's also a Frederick Douglass service learning curriculum to go along with the project. And so what we're doing is we're working to create 1 million minds, 1 million abolitionists in the style of Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And so I just brought a few photographs so you could see some of the giveaways. This is at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Anacostia. That was a group from Michigan. This is in South Central LA at a place called Home. This was at the launch at the Library of Congress when we launched the project in February of 2017. There's a young Harriet Tubman in the making. Now, this young man is in detention. His principal sent this photograph with his permission and said, Mr. Morris, I want you to see what we do at our school when they're in detention. We read Frederick Douglass. And I said, so I've got to meet this young man. So I had a chance to visit his school, Verbum Dei, in Los Angeles. And there he is after reading Frederick Douglass's narrative. And we gave away 500 books that day. This is in New Jersey, in Newark, New Jersey, at St. Benedict's Academy. We gave away 650 books that day to the young scholars. So as you can see, they're being introduced to the life of Frederick Douglass, and they're being empowered to take action. Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And Booker T. Washington said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else. And so our young people are lifting themselves up by working on these global issues that's greater than they are. Now, not all of them are going to be as passionate about fighting against trafficking as we are, but we want them to be passionate about something. And so when I talk to them, they'll say, well, we're passionate about eradicating poverty or homelessness or fighting for the rights for women and girls. Whatever it is, we just want them to be inspired by Frederick Douglass's words to affect change in their community. This is Malik. We really got the idea from this one story. Right when we started in 2007, I visited an elementary school, and I was speaking to 300 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. And I brought a first edition copy of Douglass's autobiography just to bring it and put it on the table to display it. And I thought the kids would get a kick out of seeing an old book, and they would say, oh, wow, that's cool. That's an old book. Well, as I told the stories that I've been telling tonight, Malik raised his hand and he said, Mr. Morris, can I come up and can I read from that book? And I said, sure, come on up. And he said, well, where should I start? I said, well, I've been doing this for a little while, and you're the first student ever to ask to do this, so why don't you just start at the first chapter and just read the first paragraph? And so as you can see, he opens the book, and he's standing, ramrod straight, and he starts projecting to the back of the room, and he's pronouncing every word correctly, and he's just really going for it. And he winds up reading the whole first chapter, and if you've read the narrative, you know that the chapters are not that long. He read the whole first chapter, and he sat down to the applause of his classmates. And when I finished the presentation, his teacher came up to me and said, I can't believe that Malik just did that. I said, I know, it was great, right? And he said, no, you don't understand. I've had this kid in my classroom for 2 years, and he's never raised his hand once to even ask a question. But there was something that he heard in the stories that day that inspired him to stand up in front of all of his classmates. And I wound up coming into contact with him again a couple years later and found out that he was a virtuoso on the piano. And he was giving back in his own way in his community. He was teaching kids how to play the piano. So he was using his talent and his passion to give back. And that's just one of many, many stories on how the lives of my ancestors and their legacies, which are tangible examples to young people that are facing so many challenges and issues in their community, to say, if they were able to overcome slavery and do that through education, there's nothing that they can't do in their own lives. And history lives in each of us. History doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that we've heard of, but it descends in each and every one of the students that we come into contact with. It lives in each and every one of you. We all descend from somebody that sacrificed, may have given of their lives just for the freedoms that we have in this country, may have given of their lives just so that some of us even have a right to sit in a classroom and get an education. We all stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. I had a young girl say to me one time, she said, "Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree, and I found that my four greats, I thought I had a lot of greats. My four-great-grandmother was born into slavery, taught herself to read and write in secret, and then she ran away. She became a businesswoman, successful businesswoman, and a philanthropist." And the young girl was so excited to tell me, so she said, "So, Mr. Morris, do you know what all of this means?" And before I had a chance to answer, she said, "It means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do." History lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forward, because we are the sons and daughters. We're the grandsons and granddaughters. Some of us are the products of slavery. This country is the product of slavery. But this country is also the product of the abolition of slavery. And from Frederick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. And from Martin Luther King Jr., we learned that as free citizens, we have the same rights as all citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by great men like my ancestors were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood flows through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. And we're worried more about LeBron James being traded to the Lakers than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. And we live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery are hard to hear from where we stand. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from the slaves of today. And if we listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from all of the young people out there that need hope, need inspiration. Our young people don't know where they come from, but it's not their fault. And I understand why these stories have not been passed down after coming out of hundreds of years of trauma and enslavement. There was no post-traumatic stress disorder designation. There was no plan for emancipation. It was just go on out there, just try and figure it out for yourselves. So I understand, but I know firsthand that when they start to have a connection to their past, you start to see them sitting up straighter in their chairs and ready to get out there and to do this work. They're empowered. They want to lift themselves up. And so when we listen close enough, that's when change will happen. And so I'll close here with this story. I was born in Washington, D.C., and I used to go on field trips to this home. This is the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Washington, D.C. It's where he spent the last 17 years of his life. And I loved that home. I loved going into the library because he had thousands of books everywhere, and I would think, never spent one day of his life in a classroom, but that's where he got his knowledge. He read everything that he could get his hands on, and that's why museums like this are so important, because it teaches and introduces young people to literacy and this idea of reading in this whole world that's out there through books and through literature. And so he had volumes everywhere, but my favorite room in the house was upstairs and down the hallway, and that was his bedroom. And you know how when you go into a museum where they've got artifacts, And they always have that velvet rope that blocks the room off so you can't get in and sit on the furniture or touch anything. Well, from the hallway into his bedroom was one of those ropes. And as a boy, I always wanted to see what was in there. So I would stretch my neck over the rope. And if I looked to the left, I could see his bed. And on his bed was his nightshirt. And next to the bed on a chair is his hat. And next to the chair on the floor is a pair of his shoes. And when I was little, I always wanted to sneak past that rope and try those shoes on. And I had a young girl ask me one time, she said, "Mr. Morris, I want to know, what must it be like to walk in the shoes of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington?" And so when we started our organization, the first speech I gave was at the visitor center at the home for a group of students. I told the story that I just told you, and then when I finished the presentation, the site manager said, "Okay, I've got a great idea. Let's go on a special VIP tour." And so there were about 25 students and parents, and we rushed up the hill. The house is on a big hill called Cedar Hill that overlooks all of Washington, D.C. And so I'm knocking the kids over because I wanted to get into the library and show them the books. And then I'm knocking them over to get up the stairs and down the hallway, and we get down to the bedroom, and boom, there's that rope that's been staring at me for 40 plus years. Well, the site manager did something they had never done before. She took down the rope, and she said, "Come on in." So all of us rushed in, and it's not a big room. So 30 plus people in there, we were standing together shoulder to shoulder, almost like sardines. And the photographer was ready to take the group picture, and he started placing people, and he said, "You go here, you go here, you go here." And as he's getting closer to me, do you know where he put me? Right next to the shoes. So I was like this, and I looked down, and I said to myself, there they are. After all of these years, all I would have to do is just slip out of my shoes. And I could step right into them, and no one would ever know. And I'm saying to myself, look at me. I'm taking pictures in Frederick Douglass's shoes. Finally. But I never did. I know, anticlimactic, I know. I never tried those shoes on because I knew that they wouldn't fit. Those shoes are too big for any of us to fit into. But what I realized at that moment was that I could take the shoes that I've got. Our young people can take the shoes that they've got, and we can lead the way to a brighter future. We can lead the way to a better tomorrow. And each and every one of us can make the difference in the lives of those around us. And just like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Cesar Chavez, pick your freedom fighter of choice. Go on to affect change in the world around us. With that, I thank you all very much for listening tonight, and God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for a few quick questions, so if anybody has a question, let me know. Raise your hand. Way in the back. Hang on one second.
Thank you. Do you know whether or not Mr. Washington ever communicated with Mr. Douglass in any way, met each other, or wrote to each other?
Yes, they did communicate. Frederick was a supporter of Tuskegee. He was writing Booker to always give his advice and his support. In fact, the last letter that Douglass wrote on February 19th, 1895, which was the night before he passed away, was to Booker T. Washington. We like to think that in the family that the last letter that he wrote was to his future in-law, and he was offering support. And Frederick actually spoke at the commencement at Tuskegee in, I think it was 1881. There's a photograph back here. It's the only image of him ever being photographed giving a speech. And I believe when we were publishing the book, Picturing Frederick Douglass, which was the book that made the case that he was the most photographed American of the 19th century, and I wrote in the afterword about that photograph from Tuskegee, and the scholars that worked on the book, Zoe Trod and John Stauffer, uncovered some letters between the two of them. And one letter which I really loved was a letter from Booker to Frederick promising to pick him up at the train station and to get him back in a timely fashion so he could make it to his next engagement. The next engagement was trying to steal the thunder of Tuskegee and trying to get him there first. So Booker worked to make sure that he got Frederick down to Tuskegee first for that commencement speech.
Thank you so much for coming out today and for the excellent work that you and your organization does. I'm wondering, thinking about people who are alive today, yourself excluded, who do you see as being an exemplar of carrying on the legacy and mission of your ancestors?
We've partnered with American University this year, and we just announced a few weeks ago a project called the FD 200, where we're recognizing activists and feminists and sports figures, celebrities that embody the spirit of Frederick Douglass through the work that they do all over the world. And so we just announced the first 10 recipients on the Guardian. The Guardian website has partnered with us. And so every Thursday they're announcing 10 more. And so there are lots of people that we recognize as embodying the spirit of Frederick Douglass. But the person that I really admire a lot is Bryan Stevenson. Many of you know him as the founder and CEO of the Equal Justice Initiative. He's an attorney by trade, and his group works to exonerate people that have been wrongfully convicted on death row. And he, along with Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, are leading voices around talking about mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex and being the new Jim Crow and slavery today. Well, we are very fortunate that Bryan wrote the introduction for us for this book. And he did just a really powerful job in making it, as I said, accessible to young people and really understanding what Frederick Douglass would have been up against as a 27-year-old fugitive slave, only 7 years removed from slavery, trying to bring down this legal institution of slavery, and how daunting that would be. And then he draws a straight line through 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years separate but equal, housing discrimination, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, all the way up to human trafficking today and mass incarceration. So Bryan Stevenson's a person really that comes to mind as that person. And again, we're just so fortunate that he wrote the introduction for our edition.
Yes, I have a question. Two questions, actually, real quick. First of all, what is your take on the speech that Booker T. Washington gave at the Atlantic Exposition? There was a lot of controversy about that. The second question is, what do you think with the political environment today, with who we have as president, what can we do to move forward some of the ideas that Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass had?
Well, the speech, what's called the Atlanta Compromise speech, was a brilliant speech. And, you know, I talked a little bit about Booker T. Washington's philosophy, and he understood, he was very pragmatic in the way that he went about education and trying to agitate for civil rights. And he said, you know, first things first, if we're going to fight for our civil rights, what good is it if we can get into an opera house if we don't have a dime to spend when we're in the opera house? So let's lift ourselves up, which he did. And we all know the debate between Du Bois and Washington, and I get asked that all the time. And the way that I describe it for children, for students to try and just kind of wrap their minds around the different philosophies is they both came from different worlds. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery. He came from the fields with a till under his arms. Du Bois was born free. He came from the city with books under his arms. And so one was working from the top down, and Du Bois and Washington was working from the bottom up, and advancement for their people met in the middle. So they both were right. There's no one way to go about things. And so I think Booker T. Washington, I was talking with somebody a little bit earlier, he was way ahead of his time, and I'm not even sure that he's understood today for what he was. He was a brilliant political strategist and thinker. When Roosevelt wanted to put judges, federal judges down in the South, he would ask Booker T. Washington for his recommendations, and so he's helping to place judges. Booker also worked with one of the Sears and Roebuck, Julius Rosenwald, who was not one of the founders, but he took over Sears and Roebuck, and he read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, and he was so inspired that they partnered together to build 6,000 Rosenwald schools throughout the South. And so I hope that answers your question there. And then with what's going on today, I mean, how much time do we have? You know, the thing is that when people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Frederick Douglass and everybody that we study in history right now, they were just people. Most of them were just starting working on local issues. And then it blossomed and bloomed into something greater than just that local issue. And so they were just everyday people that saw injustice and they wanted to do something about it. So when we see something that doesn't look right, doesn't feel right, doesn't sound right, are we just going to remain silent and do nothing about it? Or we as one person, as one voice, can we do something about it? So if you see something, so if you know better, then do better. And so that's, I mean, I could talk a little bit longer on that, but I think people want to get out of here.
One more question?
Okay.
Thank you. Did Frederick Douglass have any connection with Illinois, the abolitionists in Illinois, or you mentioned the Rosenthal, or with Chicago, with speeches in Chicago at all? Would you know?
Yeah, he spoke at the Columbian Exposition near the end of his life, 2 years before he passed away. I mentioned he was ambassador or consul general to Haiti, so he was in the Haitian pavilion, and there was a whole connection which I invite you to read back here and learn about the connection in the pamphlet that he and Ida B. Wells published for that exposition. But we were talking about, Carrie, how many speeches or talks did Frederick Douglass give?
In the research for this exhibit, they went through and cataloged about 800 speeches between 1865 and 1895 that Douglass gave. So that is even before his work, I mean after his work on abolition.
Yeah, so he was all throughout Illinois and Ohio, even before that period. You know, he was with the Anti-Slavery Society. He was in Pendleton, Indiana, I believe in 1843, where he was attacked by a mob. He was knocked unconscious, left bloody, and with a broken hand, his right hand, which never recovered. You can look at some of the photographs where you can see his right hand, where you can see a little bit of a deformity in it. So he was everywhere. We do an Underground Railroad trip every year for teachers, and we did actually 4 this year, and they're week-long trips, and we travel through Ohio and into Michigan and then into Canada, across Canada, down into Auburn, New York, and we end at Frederick Douglass's gravesite. And I'm just always amazed at every place I go, even throughout Canada, he was there. And so I'm sure that we could research the Illinois history and find lots and lots of places that he spoke.
Thank you, Kenneth, for this. It was wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.